Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at a deck tech for Junk Midrange for the Theros Season of Standard. And this is a deck that I've been talking about on my Facebook page for quite some time now. I've been playing it, and I've had the chance to play it at a few events and at least be able to test a few different cards out and see what I like and ultimately come up with a list that I feel really confident with. And a lot of different things made their way into this deck and then slowly started just kind of falling out, and I didn't really want them, or they really didn't do as well in this type of a deck. There were things like Archangel of Thune that were fun to play in this deck but weren't necessary. Also, Scavenging Ooze was something that I started out with but ended up cutting out of this deck as well. But ultimately, this is the more finalized list. This is what I feel most confident with playing in Junk right now. So the entire deck list is down below where you guys can check it out. There's also a deck list via TappedOut.net, so you guys can check it out on there, and you can scroll over the names of the cards. And if you're not familiar with anything, whenever you scroll over with the cursor, a image of the card will pop up, and you can read what it does, and you can become familiar with the cards in this deck. So, to start out, we have our creatures here up at the top. So, we have a playset of Sylvan Caryatid up there. So, Sylvan Caryatid 0/3 for 2, Defender Hexproof, taps for 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And with Sylvan Caryatid, I don't like playing Elvish Mystic in this type of a deck, and more specifically, I don't like playing more than 4 mana dorks in this type of a deck, just because it's being a little bit too greedy with how quick you want to be playing with this deck. And if your opponent has a way to follow up and answer the things that you're doing in this deck, then you pretty much have gotten nowhere with it, and all you're stuck with is mana dorks. So that's definitely a downside to it, but for this type of a deck, I'm only playing 4 mana dorks, and Sylvan Caryatid is definitely the perfect one to have because it blocks aggro creatures that our opponent may play on like turn 1, turn 2, and it is also going to be a hexproof body, so if our opponent has like removal, the removal is not going to be able to hit the Caryatid if it's spot removal, if they are just seeking to get rid of it to deprive us of mana ramping or anything like that. So that's definitely a plus side to it. I have a playset of Voice of Resurgence, so with the Voice of Resurgence, 2/2 for 2, whenever it dies or whenever an opponent casts a spell during our turn, we get to get a green and white elemental token with power and toughness equal to the number of creatures we control. So, like, up against removal, Voice is pretty much like 2 bodies in 1 unless our opponent finds a way to exile it with, like, Anger of the Gods or anything like that. But ultimately, it's like 2 bodies in 1. It's good up against control, and that's pretty much the biggest thing about it, is it makes counter magic a little bit less appealing for control players, which is something that we want to have happening, and it makes far and away far worse for our opponent as well, which is a problematic card whenever it comes to a variety of different situations that we may get into. Like having Voice of Resurgence out when our opponent would want to or would like to play far and away definitely makes it a lot worse for them. We have a playset of Loxodon Smiter, so 4/4 for 3, can't be countered, and if a spell or ability an opponent controls would cause us to discard him from our hand, we get to put him onto the battlefield instead of our graveyard, which is definitely a plus side, but unfortunately the only time that ends up being relevant is if our opponent plays like Thoughtseize and the only thing we have in our hand is like the Loxodon Smiter as the target that they can choose, or if they play Rakdos as a return and we happen to have Loxodon Smiter in our hand, then we get value off of that. Both of those don't happen very often, but having a 4/4 uncounterable creature for 3 is definitely nice to have up against like the control matchups. It's another thing that's going to stick, and our opponent has to find a way to either wrath the board or get rid of it specifically. I have 2 Sin Collectors. I'm not as huge about Sin Collector in this format. However, Sin Collector is still really good up against the control matchups and pretty much anything that's just running a lot of instants and sorceries in their hand. Like, if we play up against like Midrange and they just have a lot of removal, or things like Advent of the Wurm in their hand, then we get to have a benefit of having the Sin Collector and playing him. But 2/1 for 3 enters the battlefield, and we get to look at our opponent's hand. We get to choose a instant or sorcery from it and exile it. But the best thing that just makes him good is pulling him up against like control. We get information, and we potentially get to take something like Far and Away, maybe like even an Azorius Charm if it comes to our opponent having only that as a resource to get rid of our creatures and put them on the top of our library. But also things like Supreme Verdict, there's just a lot of different optimal things that we can get rid of. Sphinx's Revelation as well, that's definitely something that we can consider taking, but getting information with Sin Collector is always good. We have 3 Desecration Demons, so the Desecration Demon 6/6 for 4 flying, a little bit less amazing whenever you're playing up against like creature-heavy decks, just because they can sack things and they can just swing around the Desecration Demon and they can play around him. But up against decks that have less creatures or pretty much like no creatures at all, when in the case of like control decks, a Desecration Demon is really good and he's really threatening. At the beginning of each combat, any opponent may sacrifice a creature, and if that player does, we have to tap Desecration Demon, but we get to put a +1/+1 counter on him, which is definitely a plus side to it. So the Desecration Demon ultimately gets bigger and more threatening. However, playing up against a deck that can perpetually just keep on making tokens or keeps on taking and putting creatures on the battlefield that they don't care about, that they can sack and just swing around the Desecration Demon, ends up making him a little bit worse, but either way, he's definitely still really threatening. We have 2 Obzedat and 2 Blood Baron. So the Obzedat, 5/5 for 5, enters the battlefield, we drain our opponent 2 life and we gain 2 life, which is pretty perfect, especially because we can bounce him at the end of our turn, exile him, and at the beginning of our next upkeep, we get to put him onto the battlefield under our control, making him really hard for our opponent to be able to deal with him in terms of like Supreme Verdict Wraths, and if we're not attacking with him, then Azorius Charm isn't going to be able to get rid of him either. But the nice thing about Obzedat is if our opponent kills him and doesn't exile him, we can get him back with the Whip of Erebos. We put him onto the battlefield, and as long as we exile him at the end of our turn, the exile from Obzedat is going to overrule the exile of Whip of Erebos, and Obzedat gets exiled. He comes back at the beginning of our upkeep as a brand new creature that has no bearing on the Whip of Erebos, and then from there we can just do whatever we want with him. So it's a nice little interaction that we have in this deck to be able to kind of like play around control if all they have is just destroy target creature type removal. So Obzedat's great for that. I have 2 Blood Baron of Vizkopa. So the Blood Baron is nice because of the pro-white and pro-black. I think that's probably the biggest thing. So he's gonna die to things like Mizium Mortars if our opponent has it, but he's not gonna die to things like Hero's Downfall, Doomblade of course because he is black, but otherwise the pro-black would just protect him from that. Also, if he had, like, if he was a 5/5, he would protect him from Selesnya Charm as well, which is another thing that hits Obzedat, so that's one thing that doesn't hit the Blood Baron, which is definitely nice. He has protection from white, so if our opponent's playing Elspeth as well and they're making tokens, the Blood Baron can get around that, but the Blood Baron also gets around things like Loxodon Smiter, Voice of Resurgence, any creatures that are multicolored and share white or black in their colors, so it's awesome for that. Lifelink is going to allow us to gain back some amount of life as well, whether that is that 4 or if we're gaining back 10 if we have that win more situation where our Blood Baron is a 10/10 if we have 30 or more life and our opponent has 10 or less life, making him a 10/10 and having flying lifelink pro white pro black, definitely really nice. But just the fact that he has pro-white and pro-black puts him in a really good position in the format right now. I have 2 Abrupt Decay, so the Abrupt Decay just to be able to get rid of things like Detention Sphere, Ashiok, smaller creatures, pretty much anything converting mana cost 3 or less that could be threatening, we are just going to be able to get rid of it. In certain cases, like against Mono Blue, it's nice up against the Night Veil Spectre because you get rid of that and it gets rid of the 3 devotion that they have going into blue. So it's good for that, but ultimately it just gets rid of a lot of different things and it's uncounterable as well, which is nice. I have 2 Doomblade and 2 Hero's Downfall. So Doomblade for non-black creatures, Hero's Downfall, no buys, a little bit more expensive but gets rid of creatures and planeswalkers. I have 1 Putrefy, which destroys a artifact or creature. It can't be regenerated. So the Putrefy is relevant for getting rid of other whips that our opponents may have, and it also gets rid of things like Bident of Thassa and Spear of Heliod. Those are pretty much like the biggest ones that get played. There's also Hammer of Purphoros in red, but I don't see it far too often. But Putrefy does get rid of the god weapons because they are artifact enchantments. So it's definitely nice for that, aside from just getting rid of creatures. We have the 2 Whip of Erebos, which gives lifelink to our creatures that we have, which is a plus side to playing up against like aggro and mid-range matchups that they have like a lot of creatures and they're just focused on getting us to 0 as quick as possible. So the lifelink definitely cushions us, especially if we're swinging and hitting with things like Desecration Demon, or go like turn 3 Loxodon Smiter, turn 4 Whip. It's great for that, or even swinging in with Obzedat. Aside from his gain 2, drain 2, being able to swing and gain 5 off of Whip is definitely really nice. We have a playset of Advent of the Wurm, probably one of my favorite cards out of Dragon's Maze. Instant speed, 4 cost, put a 5/5 creature token, it's a Wurm token, Wurm creature token with trample onto the battlefield because I can't talk today. So Advent of the Wurm is probably like one of the easiest ways that you can play around control, especially like with their board wipes and anything that they may have. Being able to get that 5/5 at the end of their turn is pretty perfect, and even playing it up against like creature decks or anything like that, putting in that 5/5, flashing it in whenever your opponent is going to assign attackers and stuff like that, definitely throws off combat math, and keeping that 4 mana open can potentially make a huge difference on how they want to deal with combat and how they want to attack with things, and if they think you have it, or they're in the mindset where they think you're just bluffing with it, and there's just a whole lot of different stuff that goes into your opponent knowing that you have Advent of the Wurm and you being able to play Advent of the Wurm in this type of a deck. So the last card that we have for our spells is Elspeth, Sun's Champion, the only Planeswalker that we have in here. So like I mentioned with cards that I was playing in this deck, one of them was Archangel of Thune, and Archangel of Thune was awesome, but ultimately with this deck I really didn't have a way to be able to deal with Blood Baron, and it's kind of narrow, but it definitely still has worked to a very fine degree, where Elspeth has been the one dedicated way to get rid of Blood Baron if our opponent has it on the battlefield. In terms of dealing with it whenever our opponent has it in their hand, we can get rid of it with Lifebane Zombie after sideboarding, or we can Thoughtseize it away. But Elspeth has been pretty much the only dedicated way that we have to have removal to be able to get rid of the Blood Baron if our opponent has it. It is going to wrath our board as well for some of the creatures that we have, but ultimately being able to get rid of Blood Baron that our opponent has definitely puts us in a nice position, because that card is extremely annoying for this type of a deck. But +1 lets us put 1/1s on the battlefield, makes 3 1/1s, -3 is going to destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater, -7 gives us an emblem where creatures you control get +2/+2 and a half flying. All of the abilities are definitely really awesome for this type of a deck, but being able to plop out 1/1s for blockers is perfect. Being able to wrath the board if need be is perfect as well. For the land base, I'm running 4 Temple Garden, 4 Overgrown Tomb, 4 Godless Shrine, so all of the shock lands that we have in our color. I have a playset of Temple of Silence, 4 Forest, 3 Swamp, and 1 Plains. So, for the sideboard that we have in the deck, we have 1 Lifebane Zombie, 3 Mistcutter Hydra, 4 Thoughtseize, 3 Unflinching Courage, 2 Golgari Charm, 1 Hero's Downfall, and 1 Underworld Connections. So, for the different cards that I chose for the sideboard, let's talk about the different matchups and how things are going to side. So, for control, for instance, I like to side into 3 Mistcutter Hydras, 4 Thoughtseize, 2 Golgari Charm, because Golgari Charm lets us play around Detention Sphere, and it lets us play around Supreme Verdict. Thoughtseize just lets us take a look at what our opponent has in their hand. We get to take threats and anything that they can dig themselves out of like certain situations with. We just want to take those. And Mistcutter Hydra, Pro Blue, it gets around things like Azorius Charm and Detention Sphere. And it's also just a really phenomenal haste creature that can't be countered, and depending on how much mana we invest into it, like the later we play it, it definitely gets to be a lot bigger, but it's in the situation where our opponent can have more mana and more things open to be able to respond to it, like with Far and Away or something like that. But Mistcutter Hydra is just phenomenal to be able to play up against control, and it's also really good up against the mono blue decks because, well, of course they're mono blue. They pretty much only have one out in that deck, and that is to overload a Cyclonic Rift and bounce everything back to our hand. But even at that point, we can just recast the Mistcutter Hydra, and we can just bash face with it. So that's the nice plus side to it. The Unflinching Courage is what I like to side in up against the aggro decks that like to deal like a ton of damage really early on. They overcommit to the board and they just try to beat us as quick as possible. It's our pseudo Armadillo Cloak, just because Armadillo Cloak is worded a little bit differently and it interacts a little bit differently whenever you enchant one of your opponent's creatures. But with Unflinching Courage, +2/+2, trample, and lifelink onto one of our creatures, it makes any of our heavy hitters that we have into something even bigger and more threatening. Like Loxodon Smiter, turn 3, turn 4, Unflinching Courage up against like red deck wins is just really dumb. It's a really easy way to be able to overcome a lot of different situations red deck wins could present us. And even if they have like Boros Reckoner, we can just assign the trample damage over to our opponent. We still are going to gain the life, and it just depends on how our opponent wants to deal with the Boros Reckoner and assigning damage and what they want to direct the damage to and whatnot. But Loxodon Smiter is just great with Unflinching Courage, but even like some of the other creatures that we have are just really nice to be able to use Unflinching Courage and just gain back a huge amount of life. Golgari Charm is also good up against aggro, where if we're playing it up against White Weenie and red deck wins, especially if the red deck is more focused on like Young Pyromancer, Instants and Sorceries, and sometimes Dino Charge as well, because I have played against a few of those decks. Golgari Charm is good with the -1/-1 for all creatures on the board mode of it, where against like White Weenie, they play a lot more X1s than red deck wins tends to, but red deck wins still has a lot of X1s that we can get rid of. Things like Jackal Pups and whatnot. So the Golgari Charm just gets rid of any 1 toughness creature, and it just gets rid of all the ones that our opponents may have, and we just deal with those, and it slows our opponents down. And it is also going to make all the other creatures that they have, if they're swinging for a certain amount of damage in the turn, then we get to make everything a little bit smaller. It's outside of getting rid of all of their 1 toughness creatures. We have the 1 Hero's Downfall, so that's for the decks where we have to worry a little bit more about the creatures and planeswalkers that they're playing in their decks. So things like Obzedat, if they're just playing Obzedat and like they're playing 3 copies of it, we are going to want to go a little bit heavier on Hero's Downfall and just have another copy of it to be able to deal with that. But also against like creature-heavy midrange, it's good. We just get rid of a variety of different things. I have played up against like Aurelia, where I need to get rid of Aurelia before like stupid things happen. So Hero's Downfall is definitely something to be able to side in up against those types of decks. Underworld Connections for the slower matchups, just because we can perpetuate a lot of card advantage for ourselves. It does have the downside of forcing us to tap that land to be able to use that ability, and we lose life, but ultimately card advantage is just really good. We draw more answers, we draw more threats, and against slower decks, that's exactly what we want to have, as we're already depriving them of things that they're using, whether it's like Thoughtseize and Sin Collector, or the combination of both, or one or the other. And then Lifebane Zombie. Lifebane Zombie is just good up against like green and white decks, especially like the mirror match. It's good just because it takes Blood Baron and Obzedat. But Lifebane Zombie, just to play up against like green-white aggro, you just get to get a lot of their different things out of their hand. Like Boon Satyr is good. You also get to take things like Loxodon Smiter, Voice of Resurgence. The only thing it doesn't hit is like Advent of the Wurm and like Selesnya Charm in their decks, which Advent of the Wurm is really the only relevant thing you have to really worry about them still having in their hand. But it gains you information as well, which is definitely pretty nice. So that is the deck tech for Junk Midrange for the Theros season of Standard. Like I mentioned before, the entire deck list is down below, including the deck list via TappedOut.net. And if you guys enjoyed this deck tech, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering content. Until next time, guys, peace out.